I'm Detective Sarah Chen, and I've worked missing persons for Detroit Metro for 8 years. I've seen runaways who came home broken, and missing people who stayed that way. I've knocked on doors in every corner of this city, from the renovated downtown lofts to the burned-out shells on the east side. The Millfield housing complex sits somewhere in between subsidized units that aren't quite slums, filled with people trying to get by. It's the kind of place where folks mind their own business, which makes it unusual when 3 different neighbors call about the same empty apartment. The calls started coming in on a Tuesday morning in October. Mrs. Patricia Valdez from 4 Ampere reported that her neighbor in 4B hadn't been seen in weeks, but she could still hear the television running at night. An hour later, James Morrison from 4C called to say the same thing, nobody coming or going from 4B, but sounds of life from inside. The third call came from directly below, apartment 3B, where tenant Lisa Park complained about footsteps pacing overhead at all hours, though she'd never seen anyone enter or leave the unit above. I drove over that afternoon, case folder balanced on my dashboard, expecting a wellness check that would end with either a relieved tenant or a call to the coroner. The Millfield complex squatted against the gray October sky like a concrete question mark, 12 stories of weathered brick and narrow windows. The parking lot was half empty, scattered with the kind of cars that ran on hope and duct tape. I found the building superintendent, Marcus Torres, in the basement maintenance room, elbow deep in a boiler that looked older than both of us combined. Apartment 4B? Torres wiped his hands on a greasy rag, shaking his head. Nobody's lived there in months, detective. Had a family move out back in June, and we haven't found new tenants yet. Economics, you know? He led me upstairs, keys jangling against his belt. These neighbors calling about noise, probably just pipes. Old building, makes all kinds of sounds. But when we reached the 4th floor, my case folder tucked under my arm, Torres stopped at the door marked 4B and slid his master key into the lock. The apartment was empty. Not just vacant empty in a way that felt deliberate. No furniture, no carpet indentations, no scuff marks on the walls. Even the light fixtures had been removed, leaving bare wire twists hanging from the ceiling like dead nerves. See? Torres gestured around the hollow space. Been like this since June. No idea what those neighbors are hearing, but it's not coming from here. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing off bare concrete. The place smelled of industrial cleaner and something else. Something stale and organic that reminded me of old photographs. In the bedroom, I found myself checking my case folder again, reading the address twice to make sure I had the right apartment. The complaints were specific. Television sounds, footsteps, the smell of cooking food. But this unit looked like it had never been lived in. I interviewed the neighbors again before leaving. Mrs. Valdez was adamant she'd heard her neighbor moving around just that morning, the sound of coffee brewing, a morning talk show playing. James Morrison described the same routine he'd been hearing for weeks. Footsteps at 6 in the morning, shower running at 6:30, then silence until evening when the television would start up again. Lisa Park, from the apartment below, insisted the pacing overhead had kept her awake the night before, slow, deliberate steps from one end of the unit to the other, like someone measuring the space. When I returned to the precinct, I pulled the building records and rental history for Millfield Apartment 4B. According to the files, the Hendricks family had lived there until June 15th, when they'd moved out owing 2 months' rent. Before them, a single tenant named David Kim had rented the unit for 3 years. The records went back 20 years, showing a steady stream of tenants, but nothing that explained the neighbors' complaints about current activity. I decided to stake out the building that night, parking across the street with a clear view of the 4th floor. The windows of 4B remained dark, while the surrounding apartments glowed with the blue flicker of televisions and the warm yellow of table lamps. Around 9 o'clock, I thought I saw movement behind the dark glass of 4B, just a shadow passing by the window, but when I radioed for backup to check it out, Officer Martinez found the apartment exactly as I'd left it that afternoon. Empty, locked, undisturbed. The next morning, I returned to the Millfield complex with a different approach. Instead of going straight to the superintendent, I knocked on doors, working my way through the building with my badge and notepad. I wanted to understand what the neighbors were actually hearing, to document their statements properly, and maybe catch some inconsistencies that would explain the confusion. But when I reached the fourth floor and knocked on the door marked 4 Ampere Mrs. Valdez answered with a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry, detective, but I think you have the wrong apartment. I'm in 4 Ampere and next door is 4C. There's number 4B on this floor." I looked at the door directly across the hall. It was marked 4C, just as she said. Between 4 Ampere and 4C, where 4B should have been, there was only wall painted the same institutional beige as the rest of the hallway, with no indication that a door had ever been there. My case folder felt suddenly heavy in my hands. I opened it and flipped through my notes from the day before, but the pages were wrong. Instead of interviews with neighbors complaining about sounds from 4B, my handwriting described conversations with tenants concerned about unusual odors from the building's ventilation system. No mentions of empty apartments or missing persons. No complaints about television sounds or footsteps overhead. "Detective," Mrs. Valdez was studying my face with concern. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." I asked her about the neighbors. She'd mentioned James Morrison in 4C, Lisa Park in 3B. She told me James Morrison had moved out months ago, and there was number 3B in the building. The third floor only had apartments A, C, and D. She'd lived in the building for 6 years and was certain about the layout. I took the elevator down to find Marcus Torres, my mind racing through possibilities. Memory problems, stress, some kind of breakdown, anything that might explain why my notes had changed and why the building's layout didn't match what I'd documented the day before. Torres was in the same basement maintenance room, working on the same ancient boiler. "Detective Chen," he said without looking up from his work, "you're back? About that ventilation complaint? I told you yesterday the system's old but functional. We're not getting any odor complaints from other tenants." Yesterday, according to my altered notes, I'd been here investigating ventilation issues, not missing persons. I asked Torres about apartment 4B, and he gave me the same puzzled look I'd gotten from Mrs. Valdez. "Detective, this building only has apartments A, C, and D on each floor. Been that way since it was built in 1972. You can check the original blueprints if you want. They're on file at the city planning office." That afternoon, I drove to the planning office and pulled the blueprints for the Millfield housing complex. Torres was right. The building had been designed with apartments A, C, and D on each floor. Number 4B, number 3B. The layout I'd walked through the day before, with its empty apartment and missing tenants, didn't exist according to any official record. But I remembered it. I remembered the hollow sound of my footsteps in that empty unit, the smell of industrial cleaner, the bare wires hanging from the ceiling. I remembered Mrs. Valdez describing her neighbor's morning routine, and James Morrison's complaints about television noise. Most disturbing of all, I remembered my own handwriting in the case folder, documenting conversations that no longer existed. I returned to the Millfield complex one more time, taking the elevator to the 4th floor and walking slowly down the hallway. Apartments 4 Ampere, 4C, and 4D, just as Mrs. Valdez and Torres had said. The wall between 4 Ampere and 4C was solid, unmarked, painted the same beige as the rest of the corridor. But when I placed my palm against it, I could swear I felt vibration on the other side, the faint hum of a television, the subtle tremor of someone walking across an apartment floor. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard what sounded like morning talk show chatter, muffled but distinct. Then footsteps, slow and measured, pacing from one end of a space to the other. The same sounds the neighbors had described, coming from an apartment that had never existed. I've kept the original case folder in my desk drawer, though it shows ventilation complaints instead of missing persons. Sometimes I take it out and read through my altered handwriting, looking for traces of what I know I originally wrote. On quiet nights at the precinct, I find myself thinking about those sounds behind the wall, about the empty apartment that 3 neighbors had described in perfect detail, about the case that was never meant to be opened. They moved me to homicide after that, said I needed a change of pace, but sometimes I drive past the Millfield complex and count the windows on the 4th floor. 4 sets, not 3. And in the space where apartment 4B should be, behind that solid beige wall, the lights are always on. I'm Detective James Murphy, Rhode Island State Police, and I've been working cases in the rural districts for 15 years. Most of my calls take me through small towns where everyone knows everyone, or out to the state forests where hikers get lost and hunters find more than they bargained for. Blackstone State Forest covers nearly 2,000 acres of dense woodland along the Massachusetts border. Old growth mixed with newer stands, cut through by hiking trails that wind deeper into shadow than most people realize. It's the kind of place where cell service cuts out a mile from the parking area, and where the canopy grows thick enough to turn midday into twilight. The call came in on a Thursday morning in late September. Dispatch told me a hiker had found what looked like human remains about 3 miles into the forest, near the old quarry trail. The witness was waiting at the trailhead parking area, ready to guide me to the location. Standard procedure for this kind of discovery: secure the scene, call in the crime scene unit, and hope it's old enough to be a natural death rather than something more complicated. I met Rebecca Walsh at the parking area around 10 in the morning. She was maybe 35, brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing hiking boots and a fleece jacket that looked well used. She had the kind of pale complexion that suggested she spent more time indoors than on trails, but her gear was quality, the sort of equipment serious hikers invest in. She seemed shaken but composed, the way people get when they've had time to process something disturbing. I found them about an hour ago, she told me, her voice steady but quiet. I was taking the quarry trail to the overlook, and I saw something that didn't look right through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a deer that had died, but when I got closer, she shook her head. I didn't touch anything, just marked the spot in my mind and came back to call it in. I radioed my location to dispatch and followed Rebecca into the forest. The quarry trail was well maintained for the first mile, marked with blue blazes on the trees, and wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. But as we moved deeper into the woods, the path narrowed, and the blazes became harder to spot. The September air was crisp, and the leaves were just beginning to turn, creating a canopy of green and gold that filtered the sunlight into scattered patches on the forest floor. Rebecca moved through the woods with purpose, never hesitating at trail junctions or stopping to get her bearings. She pointed out landmarks as we walked: a distinctive granite boulder, a dead oak split by lightning, a section where the trail curved around a seasonal stream. Her descriptions were precise, the kind of detailed observations that come from someone who pays attention to their surroundings. But something about her familiarity with the area struck me as odd. The quarry trail wasn't one of the more popular routes in Blackstone, and she'd mentioned this was where she'd been heading when she made the discovery. After about 45 minutes of hiking, Rebecca stopped beside a cluster of white birch trees and pointed through the undergrowth. "There," she said, "about 30 yards in, near that fallen log." I could see what she meant, something pale and unnatural among the brown leaves and forest debris. I called in my location to dispatch, though I wasn't sure my radio signal was strong enough to reach them through the canopy. The response came back weak and distorted, but I caught enough to know they'd received my transmission. "I'll need you to wait here while I examine the scene," I told Rebecca. "This could take a while, and I might need you to show the crime scene team the way back when they arrive." She nodded and settled onto a fallen log beside the trail. I made my way carefully through the undergrowth, watching where I stepped and mentally cataloging what I saw. The remains were human, definitely, though they'd been there long enough for the elements to do their work. Scattered bones, fragments of clothing, nothing immediately obvious about cause of death. It would take a forensic anthropologist to determine much more than that. I was photographing the scene with my phone when I realized I could no longer hear Rebecca moving around behind me. The forest had gone completely quiet, no footsteps, no rustle of fabric, no sound of someone shifting position on the log where I'd left her. When I turned back toward the trail, the log was empty. "Rebecca," I called out, loud enough for my voice to carry through the trees. "Rebecca Walsh?" No response. I walked back to where she'd been sitting, looking for signs that she'd wandered off, or decided to head back to the parking area. But there were no fresh footprints in the soft earth around the log, no broken branches or disturbed leaves to indicate someone had passed through recently. It was as if she'd simply vanished. I tried my radio again, hoping to raise dispatch and ask if anyone had seen her leave the forest, but the signal was too weak, and all I got back was static. The crime scene team would be at least another hour reaching this location, and I couldn't leave the remains unattended to go looking for a witness who might have simply decided she didn't want to spend her morning answering questions about dead bodies. But as I returned to documenting the scene, I heard something that made me stop and listen. A voice, faint and distant, calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. It sounded like someone shouting for help, though the words were too muffled by distance and trees for me to make them out clearly. The voice was female, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the old quarry, farther along the trail than most hikers usually went. I shouldered my radio and headed toward the sound, moving as quickly as I could, while still being careful about disturbing the crime scene. But the farther I walked, the more distant the voice seemed to become, as if whoever was calling was moving away from me through the woods. After 20 minutes of following what I thought was the sound, I realized I could no longer hear it at all. When the crime scene team finally arrived, led by Officer Patricia Nunez from our forensics unit, I explained that my witness had disappeared while I was examining the remains. Nunez took it in stride. Civilians got uncomfortable around death scenes, and it wasn't unusual for someone to decide they'd rather not be involved once the reality of police procedure set in. "Did you get her contact information?" Nunez asked while setting up the perimeter tape. I checked my notepad, but I realized I'd never asked Rebecca for her address or phone number. I'd been planning to get those details after securing the scene, but she'd vanished before I had the chance. I had her name and a general description, but nothing that would help me track her down later. The forensics work took most of the day. The remains were old, at least several months, possibly longer. No obvious signs of trauma, no identification, and nothing in the surrounding area to suggest this was anything other than someone who'd gotten lost in the woods and died of exposure or medical emergency. We'd have to wait for the lab results to know more. I was packing up my equipment when I heard the voice again, faint but unmistakable, calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. This time I was certain it was the same voice I'd heard earlier, and it sounded like it was saying, "Help me," over and over again. Officer Nunez heard it too. "Someone else out there?" she asked, looking up from her evidence bags. "Maybe," I said, but I was already thinking about Rebecca Walsh and the way she'd vanished without leaving any trace of her passage through the woods. We tried to follow the sound, but like before, it seemed to move away from us the closer we got to its source. By the time we reached the old quarry, the sun was setting and the voice had faded to silence. The quarry itself was just a water-filled depression in the rock, surrounded by stone walls and overgrown with decades of vegetation. Local kids sometimes came here to swim in summer, but it wasn't the kind of place most hikers bothered to visit. That night, back at the station, I ran Rebecca Walsh through every database we had access to. No driver's license, no arrest record, no voter registration, no social media presence. I expanded the search to neighboring states and came up empty. As far as any official record was concerned, Rebecca Walsh didn't exist. But I kept thinking about how well she'd known those trails, and about the voice calling for help from deep in the Blackstone forest. Over the next week, I found myself driving out to the trailhead after my shifts ended, walking the quarry trail in the gathering darkness and listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. And I heard them. Every night I returned to those woods, I heard Rebecca's voice calling from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, always just out of sight, always moving deeper into the forest, no matter how far I followed. The voice that led me to a body that had been waiting in those woods for months, maybe years. The voice of a woman who had never existed, calling for help that would never come. I stopped going back to Blackstone after 2 weeks. The case was officially closed as an unidentified natural death, and there was no reason to keep hiking those trails in the dark. But sometimes, when I'm driving the back roads near the forest, I roll down my windows and listen to the night sounds carrying through the trees. And sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, I catch the sound of someone calling for help from deep in those woods, a voice I know I'll never find, no matter how far into the darkness I'm willing to follow it. I'm Detective Lisa Rodriguez, Metro Transit Police for Washington, D.C., and I've spent 11 years working cases that most city cops never see. Transit crime is its own world. Pickpockets, who work the rush hour crowds, fare jumpers who know every emergency exit, and the occasional jumper who decides the third rail looks like a solution to problems too big for therapy. Most of my calls take me through the maze of tunnels and platforms that keep this city moving, but there are parts of the system that haven't moved anything in years. The abandoned stations are supposed to be sealed, their entrances bricked over or grated shut, but the metro system has been expanding and contracting for decades. Riverside Station was one of the casualties, a platform that served a residential area that never developed the way city planners expected. According to the files, it was closed to passenger service in 1994 and officially decommissioned 2 years later. The platform was supposed to be stripped of equipment and sealed permanently, but budget cuts meant a lot of those projects never got completed properly. The first complaint came in on a Monday morning in October. A commuter named Angela Foster called to report hearing screams echoing through the tunnel walls while waiting for the red line at Union Station. She said the sounds were coming from somewhere in the direction of the old Riverside platform, and they were loud enough to hear over the normal tunnel noise of approaching trains. Dispatch logged it as a possible trespasser situation and assigned it to me for follow-up. I met with Angela Foster that afternoon during her evening commute. She was maybe 40, wearing a business suit and carrying the kind of worn briefcase that suggested years of the same routine. She'd been taking the red line to and from work for 8 years, she told me, and she knew the normal sounds of the system, the rumble of approaching trains, the hiss of pneumatic doors, the echo of announcements bouncing off tunnel walls. But this was different, she said, glancing nervously at the tunnel entrance as we talked on the platform. It sounded like someone screaming for help, but muffled, like it was coming through thick walls or from very far away. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, and then it stopped completely. I asked her if she'd noticed anything else unusual, homeless individuals in the tunnels, maintenance work that might explain strange sounds, anything that could account for what she'd heard. But Angela was certain the sounds were human distress, not mechanical noise or routine maintenance. She'd heard them twice more since the first incident, always around the same time of morning, always seeming to come from the direction of the sealed Riverside platform. I spent that evening reviewing the transit authority's records for the abandoned station. The official documentation was surprisingly sparse. Work orders for sealing the entrances, notifications to security about restricted access, but no detailed reports about what equipment had been removed or how thoroughly the platform had been secured. The blueprints showed Riverside as a standard 2-track station with a center platform, but the architectural drawings were from 1973, before several system modifications that might have changed the layout. The next morning, I took the red line toward Union Station and got off at the stop before Riverside's location. I wanted to walk the tunnel and see if I could access the abandoned platform from the active tracks. Transit worker David Kim met me at the platform with a set of master keys and a maintenance flashlight that could cut through the tunnel darkness. Riverside Station? Kim shook his head as we walked toward the tunnel entrance. Detective, that platform was demolished years ago. 1998, I think. They didn't just seal it, they tore out the concrete and filled in the space with rubble. There's nothing down there but solid tunnel wall. But as we made our way along the tracks, following the maintenance walkway that ran parallel to the rails, I could see what looked like platform infrastructure ahead in the darkness. The beam of Kim's flashlight picked out concrete edges and support pillars that suggested a station platform, not the solid tunnel wall he'd described. "That's impossible," Kim muttered, playing his light over what was clearly a passenger platform. "This section was supposed to be filled in. I've seen the work orders." The platform stretched into the darkness beyond our flashlight beam, looking exactly like an abandoned metro station. Should look concrete surfaces stained with years of moisture, support pillars tagged with graffiti, and the metal framework that once held platform lighting and signage. But something about the layout didn't match the blueprints I'd studied. The platform seemed longer than it should be, and there were 3 sets of tracks instead of the 2 shown in the architectural drawings. We climbed up onto the platform, and I immediately noticed that the air felt different, stale and close, as if the ventilation systems hadn't been working for years. But there were fresh signs of human presence. Food wrappers that looked recent, a plastic water bottle that hadn't had time to accumulate the layer of dust that covered everything else, and what looked like footprints in the grime near the platform edge. "Someone's been down here," I told Kim, photographing the evidence with my phone. "Recent activity, probably within the last few days." Kim was studying the platform layout with obvious confusion. "Detective, this doesn't match any configuration I've seen in the system. 3 tracks, center platform, that's not how Riverside was designed. And look at those platform numbers." I followed his flashlight beam to the old signage mounted on the support pillars. Instead of the standard metro platform identifications, the signs showed numbers that didn't correspond to any system I was familiar with. Platform 6, Platform 7, Platform 8. The metro system didn't use sequential numbering like that, and certainly not numbers that high for a 2-track station. We were examining the unusual signage when I heard what Angela Foster had described, a sound that might have been human screaming, echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. It was muffled and distant, but unmistakably the sound of someone in distress. The echo made it impossible to determine which direction it was coming from, but it seemed to be originating from one of the unused tracks that extended into darkness beyond our platform. "Did you hear that?" I asked Kim, but he was already moving toward the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the tunnel blackness. "We need to check the other platforms," he said, but his voice had a strange quality to it, as if he was speaking from much farther away than the few feet that separated us. I followed Kim's flashlight deeper into the station complex, but the farther we walked, the more the layout seemed to contradict everything I knew about metro station design. The platform we'd started on connected to other platforms through a series of passages and stairways that shouldn't have existed in an abandoned 2-track station. Each new level revealed more tracks, more platforms, more signs with numbers that climbed higher than any metro system would logically need. My radio crackled with static as we descended to what Kim insisted was Platform 12, though I had no memory of walking down enough stairs to reach a level that deep underground. When I tried to call in our location to dispatch, all I got back was distorted voices that might have been speaking English, but with words I couldn't quite make out. The screaming sound came again, closer now, and this time I could tell it was coming from the track level below us. Kim's flashlight picked out a stairway leading down to what looked like another platform, this one with 4 tracks and signage indicating Platform 15. The numbers were getting higher the deeper we went, which violated every principle of logical transit design. But Kim kept insisting that this was all part of the original Riverside Station complex. The renovation plans from '96, he was saying as we walked down the stairs, though I couldn't remember him mentioning any renovation plans before. They expanded the platform system before they closed it. Multiple levels, connections to the freight tunnels, emergency evacuation routes. It's all in the files. But I knew there were no such files. I'd reviewed everything the transit authority had on Riverside Station, and none of it mentioned multiple platforms or deep-level construction. Yet here we were, walking through a station complex that seemed to extend far below the level where any metro station should logically exist. Platform 15 was larger than the others, with tracks that disappeared into tunnels running in directions that didn't correspond to any metro lines I knew. The platform itself was maybe 200 feet long, with overhead lighting that flickered intermittently, casting moving shadows that made the space feel alive and unstable. And at the far end of the platform, near the entrance to one of the tunnels, I could see a figure. Someone was standing near the track, motionless, facing away from us toward the dark tunnel mouth. In the uncertain light, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, but the figure seemed to be wearing clothing that looked wrong, somehow too formal for someone who'd be trespassing in abandoned transit tunnels, and cut in a style that seemed decades out of date. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the large space. "Metro Transit Police. I need to speak with you." The figure didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. But as Kim and I approached, I could hear what sounded like crying, quiet, steady sobbing that seemed to be coming from the person near the track. When we got within about 20 feet, I could see that it was a woman wearing what looked like a 1970s business suit, her hair styled in a way that suggested the same era. "Ma'am, you can't be down here," I said, reaching for my radio to call for backup. But when I tried to transmit, all I got was static and the sound of voices that seemed to be speaking backwards. The woman turned around, and I saw a face that was completely wrong, not disfigured or injured, but wrong in a fundamental way that my mind couldn't quite process. Her features were all present and arranged normally, but they didn't seem to belong together, as if someone had carefully constructed a human face using parts that had never been intended to form a whole. "The train doesn't come anymore," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance between us. "I've been waiting since 1996, but the train doesn't come anymore." Kim's flashlight began flickering, and in the strobing light, I could see that there were other figures on the platform, now maybe a dozen people scattered along the length of the space, all wearing clothing that looked decades out of date, all standing motionless near the track edges. They hadn't been there when we'd first entered the platform, but now they were present as if they'd always been waiting. The screaming sound came again, but now I could tell it wasn't coming from any of the figures on the platform. It was coming from the tracks themselves, or from somewhere beyond the tunnel mouths, where the tracks disappeared into absolute darkness. And underneath the screaming, I could hear something that sounded like an approaching train, the familiar rumble and squeal of metro cars on rails, growing louder as if something was actually coming toward our platform. But there were no active lines that connected to this part of the system. According to every map and blueprint I'd ever seen, there were no tracks down here at all. Yet the sound of the approaching train grew louder, and the figures on the platform began moving toward the track edges, as if preparing to board. My radio suddenly came alive with clear transmission, and I heard my own voice calling for backup at Riverside Station, Platform 15. But I wasn't transmitting anything, and I'd never given that location to dispatch. The voice that sounded like mine was requesting immediate assistance for multiple trespassers and possible medical emergencies, and it was providing coordinates that placed us far deeper underground than any metro station had ever been built. The train sounds reached a crescendo and then stopped completely, leaving the platform in absolute silence. When Kim's flashlight finally steadied, the other figures had vanished, leaving only the woman in the 70s business suit standing near the track. She looked directly at me with her impossible face and smiled. "The train came," she said. Finally, the train came. I found myself back on street level an hour later, standing outside the official entrance to Riverside Station, an entrance that was properly sealed with concrete barriers and no trespassing signs. David Kim was beside me, looking as confused as I felt, holding a maintenance flashlight and a set of keys he couldn't remember using. The case report I filed described a routine investigation of trespasser complaints that revealed no evidence of unauthorized access to the abandoned Riverside platform. I noted that the station appeared to be properly secured and that no further investigation was warranted. But I kept the photographs I'd taken on my phone, images of platforms and track configurations that didn't match any blueprints in the Transit Authority's files. Sometimes, when I'm riding the Red Line during off-peak hours, I listen carefully to the tunnel sounds between stations. And sometimes, just for a moment, I hear what might be train sounds coming from directions where no trains run, the echo of something moving through platforms that were never built, carrying passengers who stopped waiting decades ago. I'm Detective Anthony Price, and I've been working cold cases for the Clearwater Police Department in Florida for 7 years. Cold cases are like archaeological digs. You spend your time sifting through evidence that's been sitting in boxes for years, sometimes decades, looking for connections that previous investigators missed, or technology that wasn't available when the crimes were first committed. Most of my work happens in the evidence storage facility in the basement of our building, a climate-controlled room lined with metal shelving units that hold thousands of boxes, each one tagged with case numbers and dates that stretch back to the 1970s. The storage facility is secured with keycard access and surveillance cameras, and everything that goes in or comes out is logged by our evidence clerk, Helen Foster. Helen has been managing the evidence room for 15 years, and she runs it like a military operation, every item cataloged, every movement documented, every box returned to its exact location after examination. She takes pride in maintaining what she calls the chain of custody, integrity, and in all my years working cold cases, I've never seen her make a filing error or lose track of evidence, which is why what I found on a Tuesday morning in November made no sense at all. I was reviewing the evidence from a 1987 missing person case, a teenage girl named Jennifer Martinez, who had disappeared from a shopping mall and never been found. The case had been reopened because advances in DNA analysis might reveal something from the evidence that had been collected at the time. But when I opened the storage box labeled Martinez, Jennifer, case number 87-421, the contents didn't match the evidence inventory. Instead of the clothing items and personal effects that should have been in the box, I found evidence from a completely different case, a burglary from 1993 involving stolen electronics and jewelry. The evidence tags still showed the Martinez case number, but the items themselves clearly belonged to the burglary investigation. I checked the evidence log to see if there had been a filing error, but according to Helen's records, the Martinez box had never been moved or accessed since it was originally stored. I brought the discrepancy to Helen's attention, thinking it was just a simple mix-up that could be corrected by finding where the Martinez evidence had been misplaced. Helen was as puzzled as I was. She prided herself on never making mistakes with evidence storage, and she couldn't understand how items from two different cases had gotten switched without any record of the movement. "Let me check the camera footage," she said, pulling up the surveillance system on her computer. Maybe someone accessed the storage room after hours and didn't follow proper logging procedures. But the camera footage showed nothing unusual. The storage room remained empty and undisturbed overnight, with no unauthorized access and no evidence of anyone moving boxes or rearranging items. The timestamps on the footage were continuous, with no gaps or glitches that might indicate tampering with the system. Over the next few days, I found more discrepancies. Evidence from a 1995 assault case had somehow mixed with items from an unrelated drug investigation from 2002. Crime scene photographs from different cases had been placed in wrong folders, and witness statements had been misfiled with completely unrelated reports. Each time I discovered a problem, Helen checked the logs and camera footage, but there was never any record of unauthorized access or evidence tampering. The most disturbing discovery came when I was reviewing the case file for a home invasion that had occurred in 2008. The original detective's handwritten notes had been supplemented with additional observations and analysis written in what looked exactly like my own handwriting. The ink was the same blue ballpoint I always used, and the writing style matched my own note-taking habits perfectly. But I had never worked on the 2008 case, and I had no memory of reviewing the file or adding any supplemental notes. When I showed the file to Helen, she pulled up the access logs and pointed to entries that showed I had checked out the case file 3 times in the past month on dates when I was certain I had been working on completely different investigations. According to the logs, I had spent several hours reviewing the evidence and had returned the file with additional documentation each time. "Detective Price," Helen said, her voice carefully neutral, "these are your signatures on the checkout forms. And look at the timestamps, they correspond exactly with your normal work hours." But I remembered those days clearly. I had been working on a fraud investigation that week, and I'd spent most of my time at the courthouse reviewing financial records, not in the evidence storage room reviewing old home invasion files. Yet there was my signature, and there were my handwritten notes, documenting observations and analysis that I had no memory of making. The situation became more unsettling when I discovered that several other case files showed similar additions in my handwriting. Cold cases I'd never opened contained detailed analysis written in my own hand, with dates and signatures that placed me in the evidence room during times when I was certain I'd been elsewhere. Helen showed me checkout logs going back 6 months, all bearing my signature, all documenting work I had no memory of performing. The breaking point came when I found supplemental notes in my handwriting that referenced events from my personal life, details about my hospitalization the previous year for emergency surgery, mentions of conversations with my partner Detective Janet Reeves that had occurred months earlier, observations about cases that connected to my own work in ways that seemed too coincidental to be random. Someone with access to my personal information and intimate knowledge of my work patterns was creating documents that perfectly mimicked my writing style and professional analysis. But the handwriting analysis came back inconclusive. The department's document examiner confirmed that the supplemental notes were consistent with my normal writing patterns, but couldn't definitively conclude whether they were authentic or expertly forged. The ink analysis showed no signs of chemical aging that might indicate the documents had been backdated, and the paper matched the standard forms used in our evidence room. Most disturbing was when Helen showed me the security footage of myself apparently reviewing case files in the evidence room. The timestamps corresponded exactly with the checkout logs, and the video clearly showed someone who looked exactly like me, examining boxes, taking notes, and returning files to their proper locations. But I watched myself perform actions I had no memory of taking, writing notes I didn't remember making, and signing forms I was certain I'd never seen before. "Detective," Helen said quietly, "I know this is unusual, but the evidence is clear. According to every record we have, you've been regularly accessing these case files for months. Your signatures, your handwriting, your face on the security cameras, everything confirms that you've been doing this work." I studied the video footage more closely, watching the figure that looked exactly like me move through the evidence room with familiar efficiency. The person on the screen knew exactly where to find specific case files, used the same note-taking methods I always employed, and even displayed the same unconscious habits I'd developed over years of evidence review, adjusting my glasses while reading, tapping my pen against my teeth while thinking, the way I always stacked files in chronological order. But as I watched, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The person on the video cast no shadow. Despite the overhead lighting in the evidence room, despite the clear definition of their movements and gestures, there was no shadow falling across the floor or the storage shelves. Everything else in the room, the boxes, the shelving units, even the papers being reviewed, cast normal shadows according to the light sources. But the figure that looked exactly like me moved through the space like it wasn't quite there. "Helen," I said, pointing at the screen, "do you see anything unusual about this footage?" She studied the video carefully, watching the figure that appeared to be me examining case files with methodical precision. "I see you doing your job, detective, same as always." But I could see that whatever was moving through that evidence room, whatever was writing notes in my handwriting and signing forms with my signature, wasn't casting a shadow. And when I looked more closely at the supplemental notes it had written, I realized they contained information about the cases that hadn't been available to the original investigators, details about evidence that would be discovered years later, connections to other crimes that wouldn't become apparent until advances in forensic technology revealed new patterns. The thing that looked like me had been solving cold cases by writing solutions in my handwriting, documenting connections between crimes that spanned decades, and filing reports that would eventually lead to arrests and convictions. It was doing the work I was supposed to be doing, but with access to information that existed outside of normal time and investigation. I stopped going to the evidence room after that. Helen handles all my case file requests now, bringing boxes to my office so I don't have to enter the storage facility myself. But sometimes I check the access logs, and I still see my signature appearing on checkout forms, still see timestamps showing that I'm reviewing cases I've never opened. The cold case closure rate for our department has improved significantly over the past year. My supervisor commends me for the thorough analysis and innovative connections I've been making between seemingly unrelated investigations. But I know the work isn't mine. It belongs to something that wears my face and writes in my handwriting, something that exists in the spaces between what happened and what gets recorded, solving mysteries with knowledge that comes from places I've never been. I'm Detective Maria Santos, and I've been working for the Thornfield Township Police Department in rural Pennsylvania for 9 years. Thornfield is the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where most of our calls involve domestic disputes or teenagers drinking in the woods behind the high school. We cover about 60 square miles of farmland and forest, connected by county roads that haven't changed much since the 1950s. Most of the families here have lived in the same houses for generations, passing down property through bloodlines that stretch back to when this area was first settled. Our dispatch center handles emergency calls for 3 townships, and we're used to the occasional prank call or missed dial that sends us out on wild goose chases. But we take every call seriously, especially break-in reports, because in rural areas like ours, response times can mean the difference between catching a burglar in the act and arriving to find an empty house and missing valuables. The residents here trust us to respond quickly, and we take that responsibility seriously. The first call came in on a Thursday evening in late October. Dispatch received a 911 report of a break-in in progress at 1427 Maple Ridge Road, with the caller whispering that someone was trying to force entry through the back door. The voice was elderly, female, clearly frightened, but trying to stay quiet to avoid detection by whoever was attempting to break in. Dispatcher Carol Hendricks logged the call and sent me out for immediate response, priority 1. I knew Maple Ridge Road well. It was a gravel lane that ran for about 2 miles, through mixed farmland and woods, with maybe 8 houses scattered along its length. 1427 was the old Thompson place, a 2-story farmhouse that had been in the same family since the 1920s. I'd been there before for welfare checks and minor complaints, and I knew the current residents were an elderly couple, Robert and Margaret Thompson, both in their 70s and both dealing with health issues that kept them mostly housebound. When I arrived, At 1427 Maple Ridge Road, the house was dark, except for a single light in what I knew was the kitchen window. My patrol car's headlights swept across a farmhouse that looked exactly as I remembered it. White clapboard siding, green shutters, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs, and a small vegetable garden beside the driveway. I approached the front door and knocked, identifying myself as police and asking if everything was all right. Robert Thompson answered the door, looking confused but not frightened. He was a thin man with white hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades of farm work. He invited me in and explained that he and Margaret had been watching television when they heard my car in the driveway, but they hadn't called 911 and weren't aware of any attempted break-in. "Detective Santos," he said, gesturing toward the back door. "You're welcome to check around the property, but we haven't heard anything unusual tonight. Margaret's been feeling poorly, so we've been inside all evening." I walked the perimeter of the house with my flashlight, checking for signs of forced entry or evidence that someone had been attempting to break in. The back door was secure, with no scratches on the lock or damage to the frame that might indicate tampering. The windows were all intact, and there were no footprints in the soft earth around the foundation that didn't belong to the residents. When I returned to the front of the house, Robert and Margaret were both on the porch, wrapped in sweaters against the October chill. Margaret Thompson was a small woman with gray hair and the kind of gentle demeanor that reminded me of my own grandmother. She confirmed that they hadn't made any emergency calls and hadn't heard any suspicious activity around their property. "Maybe someone called in a wrong address," Margaret suggested. "You know how it is with these county roads, easy to get confused about house numbers, especially in the dark." I filed the incident as a false alarm and headed back to the station, thinking it was probably exactly what Margaret had suggested, a misdial or address confusion that had sent me to the wrong location. But 3 days later, we received another identical call. Same voice, same whispered report of someone trying to break in through the back door at 1427 Maple Ridge Road. Same frightened tone, same request for immediate police response. Dispatcher Carol Hendricks sent me out again, and I made the familiar drive down the gravel road toward the Thompson property. But when I arrived at 1427 Maple Ridge Road, the house looked different. The white clapboard siding was grayer, more weathered, and several of the green shutters were hanging at odd angles or missing entirely. The wraparound porch sagged noticeably, and the vegetable garden beside the driveway had been overtaken by weeds. It was still recognizably the same house, but it looked like it had aged decades since my visit 3 days earlier. When I knocked on the front door, it was answered by a different Robert Thompson, younger, maybe in his 40s, with dark hair and the same weathered hands I'd noticed on the elderly Robert. He seemed surprised to see me, but invited me inside to discuss the reason for my visit. 911 call about a break-in, I explained, studying his face for signs of recognition or deception. "Someone reported that someone was trying to force entry through your back door." This Robert Thompson looked genuinely puzzled. "Detective, I've been home all evening with my wife and kids. We haven't had any trouble, and we certainly didn't call the police." He introduced me to his wife, Dorothy Thompson, a woman in her 30s with brown hair and an apron that suggested she'd been cooking dinner when I arrived. Their 2 children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, peered at me from the living room doorway with the kind of curious caution that kids show toward police officers. I repeated my perimeter check, looking for evidence of attempted break-in, but found the same results as before. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of unauthorized activity around the property. When I asked Robert how long his family had lived at this address, he told me the house had been in the Thompson family for generations, passed down from his grandfather who'd built it in the 1920s. The discrepancy between this visit and my previous response bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong. The house looked older and more run down, and the residents were different people, but they were still Thompsons, living at 1427 Maple Ridge Road. Rural families often have multiple generations living in the same area, and it wasn't unusual for property to change hands within a family while keeping the same last name. When I got back to the station, I pulled the county property records for 1427 Maple Ridge Road. According to the official documents, the property was owned by Robert and Margaret Thompson, the elderly couple I'd met during my first response. There were no records of recent property transfers or family arrangements that might explain why a different Robert Thompson was now living in the house. The third call came a week later. Same voice, same report, same address. By now, Carol Hendricks recognized the pattern and logged the call with a note about previous responses to the same location. But when I arrived at 1427 Maple Ridge Road for the third time, the house had deteriorated even further. The clapboard siding was now gray and peeling, with several boards missing entirely. The porch roof had partially collapsed, and most of the windows were either broken or boarded over with plywood. The house looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet there were signs of recent habitation: a car in the driveway, smoke rising from the chimney, and lights visible through the few intact windows. This time, the door was answered by a Robert Thompson, who looked to be in his 20s, thin and pale, wearing clothes that seemed decades out of style. He lived alone, he told me, and had inherited the house from his father, who died the previous winter. He'd never made a 911 call and wasn't aware of any break-in attempts, but he invited me to search the property if it would help with my investigation. The interior of the house reflected its exterior deterioration: wallpaper peeling from the walls, floorboards warped and stained, and a smell of dampness and decay that suggested serious structural problems. But Robert Thompson seemed comfortable in the surroundings, moving through the damaged rooms with familiarity and showing no concern about the condition of his home. When I asked him about the previous residents, he looked confused. "Detective, my family's lived here since the house was built. There's never been anyone else living at this address." That night, I called the phone company to trace the origin of the 911 calls. The number showed up in their system, but when I spoke with Supervisor Thomas Brennan, he told me something that made my skin crawl. "Detective Santos, that phone line was disconnected in 1987 when the original service account was closed. According to our records, there's been no active phone service at that address for over 20 years. But the calls kept coming. Same voice, same report, same impossible phone number that had been disconnected decades ago. Each response took me to a more deteriorated version of 1427 Maple Ridge Road, with a progressively younger Robert Thompson claiming generational ownership of property that seemed to be aging backward through time. On my fifth response to the address, I found a house that was barely standing. Walls collapsed, roof caved in, foundation crumbling. But Robert Thompson was still there, now a teenager with hollow eyes and clothes that looked like they belonged to the early 20th century. He spoke in an accent I didn't recognize, using words and phrases that sounded archaic, but he still claimed to be a Thompson and insisted his family had always lived on Maple Ridge Road. The last call came on a night in early November. Same voice, but weaker now, more distant. When I arrived at 1427 Maple Ridge Road, I found only a foundation stone and a mailbox that read Thompson in faded letters. No house, no residence, no evidence that any structure had ever stood on the property. But as I stood beside my patrol car in the darkness, I could hear something that made me question everything I thought I knew about that address. The sound of a phone ringing, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere in the ground where the house should have been. And underneath the ringing, barely audible, the sound of an elderly woman's voice whispering for help, calling from a place that existed only in the space between what was and what had been. I don't respond to calls on Maple Ridge Road anymore. Carol Hendricks routes those dispatches to other officers, and I've never explained why. But sometimes I drive past the empty lot where 1427 used to be, and I listened for the sound of a phone that was disconnected before I was born, ringing with calls from people who need help in a house that's still there, somewhere in the past where emergency responses can never reach. I'm Detective Robert Hayes, and I've been with the Moreland Police Department in Oregon for 13 years. Our precinct is housed in a 3-story brick building that was constructed in 1968 to replace the old wooden structure that had served the department since the town's incorporation. The building is solid and functional, with offices on the upper floors, holding cells and interview rooms on the main level, and what was supposed to be a basement level that was filled with concrete during construction due to soil stability issues. The basement has always been a subject of minor curiosity among the officers. The architectural plans show it was originally designed to house additional storage and a larger evidence room, but geological surveys revealed that the foundation would need extensive reinforcement to support a basement level safely. Rather than delay construction and exceed budget, the City Council decided to fill the basement space with concrete and build everything on the main level and above. I'd worked in the building for over a decade without giving the basement much thought. We had adequate storage on the upper levels, and the evidence room on the main floor served our needs well enough for a department our size. But in November, several officers began reporting strange sounds coming from below the building, sounds that resembled voices, footsteps, and what sounded like interrogation sessions being conducted in rooms that didn't exist. The first report came from Officer Janet Crowley, who was working late on paperwork in her office on the second floor. She told me she'd heard what sounded like a heated conversation coming from directly below her office, voices raised in the kind of confrontational tone that suggested an interrogation in progress. But when she checked the duty roster, no interviews were scheduled for that evening, and all the ground-level interview rooms were empty and locked. 2 days later, Sergeant Michael Grant reported similar sounds, voices, chair scraping, and what sounded like someone typing reports, coming from beneath the evidence room during his late shift. When he investigated, he found no one in the building except the night dispatcher and one officer on patrol. All the rooms on the main level were secured and showed no signs of recent activity. Captain Laura Whitman asked me to investigate the reports, thinking it might be a problem with the building's heating system or pipes that was creating sounds that could be mistaken for human voices. Old buildings often develop acoustic quirks, and sounds can travel through ductwork in ways that make them seem to come from unexpected locations. I spent a Thursday evening in the precinct after regular hours, moving through the building and listening for the sounds my colleagues had described. Around 10 o'clock, I heard what they'd been reporting, the distinct sound of conversation coming from somewhere below the main floor. It wasn't the random noise of settling pipes or heating systems. It was clearly human voices, engaged in what sounded like a professional discussion. The sounds seemed to be coming from directly beneath the main evidence room, but according to the building plans, that space should have been solid concrete. I went down to the evidence room and examined the floor carefully, looking for any access panels or maintenance hatches that might explain how sounds could be traveling from below. The floor was solid linoleum over concrete, with no visible seams or openings. But as I knelt on the evidence room floor, listening to the voices that seemed to be coming from directly beneath me, I noticed something that made me pause. Near the back corner of the room, partially hidden behind a tall filing cabinet, there was what looked like an access panel set into the floor. The panel was painted the same color as the surrounding linoleum, making it nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. I moved the filing cabinet and examined the panel more closely. It was definitely an access hatch, secured with a simple latch mechanism that didn't appear to be locked. When I lifted the panel, I found a narrow stairway leading down into darkness. The stairs were concrete, well constructed, and showed signs of regular use, despite the fact that they led to a basement level that was supposed to be filled with solid concrete. I grabbed a flashlight from the evidence room and descended the stairs. expecting to find a small utility space or maintenance area that might have been overlooked in the building records. But what I found was a fully functional basement level, with multiple rooms, fluorescent lighting, and furnishings that matched the rest of the precinct. The basement contained what appeared to be additional interview rooms, offices, and storage areas, all laid out according to the original architectural plans I'd seen for the building. The rooms were equipped with standard police department furniture, metal desks, filing cabinets, chairs, and the kind of institutional lighting fixtures used throughout the rest of the precinct. Everything looked recently used and well maintained, as if this level of the building had been in regular operation. In one of the basement offices, I found case files spread across a desk with handwritten notes that appeared fresh and a coffee cup that was still warm to the touch. The files were labeled with case numbers that didn't match our department's numbering system, and they were signed by detectives whose names I didn't recognize. The signature on most of the paperwork belonged to someone named Patricia Morse, Detective Second Class, but there was no one by that name in our department roster. I photographed the case files with my phone and gathered several of the documents to examine more closely. The reports detailed investigations of crimes that had occurred in Moreland, but they referenced streets and addresses that didn't exist in our jurisdiction. The witness statements and evidence logs followed proper police procedures, but they documented events that had no corresponding reports in our official files. Most disturbing were the dates on the paperwork. The case files were dated with recent timestamps, some from earlier that week, others from just days before, but they detailed investigations conducted by officers who had no record of employment with our department. The reports were professional, thorough, and followed all proper protocols, but they appeared to document police work being done by people who didn't officially exist. I spent 3 hours exploring the basement level, finding room after room that should have been filled with concrete. The spaces were all functional and showed clear signs of regular use: fresh supplies in the storage rooms, recently used interview tables, and trash cans that contained paper from the current week. Someone had been working in this basement regularly, conducting investigations and filing reports, but there was no record of this activity in any official department documentation. When I tried to access the basement the following day, bringing Sergeant Grant with me to witness what I'd found, the access panel in the evidence room floor was gone. The corner where I'd moved the filing cabinet showed only solid linoleum over concrete, with no seams or openings to indicate that a hatch had ever been installed there. Grant helped me search the entire evidence room, but we found no way to access the basement level. That evening, I returned to the precinct alone and searched every room on the main floor, looking for another access point to the basement. In the back corner of interview room 3, behind a supply cabinet that seemed heavier than it should have been, I found another access panel. This one led to the same basement level, but the rooms I discovered were different from the ones I'd explored the night before. The layout was similar, but the offices were arranged differently, and the case files I found belonged to different detectives whose names were unfamiliar to me. Detective William Chen, Detective Sandra Fuller, Detective Raymond Park, all conducting investigations in our jurisdiction, all filing reports that followed proper procedures, but none of them appearing in any department records I could access. Each night I returned, I found the basement through different access points that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. Sometimes the panel would be in the holding cell area, sometimes in the supply closet near the dispatcher's office, sometimes behind equipment in the communications room. The basement itself remained consistent, a fully functional police facility with active investigations and fresh evidence of recent work, but the detectives whose files I found there were different each time. The rooms were equipped with standard police department furniture, metal desks, filing cabinets, chairs, and the kind of institutional lighting fixtures used throughout the rest of the precinct. Everything looked recently used and well maintained, as if this level of the building had been in regular operation. In one of the basement offices, I found case files spread across a desk with handwritten notes that appeared fresh and a coffee cup that was still warm to the touch. The files were labeled with case numbers that didn't match our department's numbering system, and they were signed by detectives whose names I didn't recognize. The signature on most of the paperwork belonged to someone named Patricia Morse, Detective Second Class, but there was no one by that name in our department roster. I photographed the case files with my phone and gathered several of the documents to examine more closely. The reports detailed investigations of crimes that had occurred in Moreland, but they referenced streets and addresses that didn't exist in our jurisdiction. The witness statements and evidence logs followed proper police procedures, but they documented events that had no corresponding reports in our official files. Most disturbing were the dates on the paperwork. The case files were dated with recent timestamps, some from earlier that week, others from just days before, but they detailed investigations conducted by officers who had no record of employment with our department. The reports were professional, thorough, and followed all proper protocols, but they appeared to document police work being done by people who didn't officially exist. I spent 3 hours exploring the basement level, finding room after room that should have been filled with concrete. The spaces were all functional and showed clear signs of regular use: fresh supplies in the storage rooms, recently used interview tables, and trash cans that contained paper from the current week. Someone had been working in this basement regularly, conducting investigations and filing reports, but there was no record of this activity in any official department documentation. When I tried to access the basement the following day, bringing Sergeant Grant with me to witness what I'd found, the access panel in the evidence room floor was gone. The corner where I'd moved the filing cabinet showed only solid linoleum over concrete, with no seams or openings to indicate that a hatch had ever been installed there. Grant helped me search the entire evidence room, but we found no way to access the basement level. That evening, I returned to the precinct alone and searched every room on the main floor, looking for another access point to the basement. In the back corner of interview room 3, behind a supply cabinet that seemed heavier than it should have been, I found another access panel. This one led to the same basement level, but the rooms I discovered were different from the ones I'd explored the night before. The layout was similar, but the offices were arranged differently, and the case files I found belonged to different detectives whose names were unfamiliar to me. Detective William Chen, Detective Sandra Fuller, Detective Raymond Park, all conducting investigations in our jurisdiction, all filing reports that followed proper procedures, but none of them appearing in any department records I could access. Each night I returned, I found the basement through different access points that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. Sometimes the panel would be in the holding cell area, sometimes in the supply closet near the dispatcher's office, sometimes behind equipment in the communications room. The basement itself remained consistent, a fully functional police facility with active investigations and fresh evidence of recent work, but the detectives whose files I found there were different each time.